Welcome to Monday. It's Meet the Press Daily. Good evening. I'm Katie Tur in New York in for Chuck Todd. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said the impeachment inquiry would move expeditiously, and it appears that is indeed the case. Some breaking news late this afternoon. President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is being subpoenaed by Congress for documents pertaining to his involvement in Ukraine. The House Intelligence Committee says it wants the documents by October 15th. And the subpoena letter comes with a message similar to the one they gave Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in his subpoena for documents on Friday. Quote, your failure or refusal to comply with the subpoena, including at the direction or behest of the president or White House, shall constitute evidence of obstruction of the House's impeachment inquiry and may be used as an adverse inference against you and the president. The subpoena letter also requests Giuliani produce any text messages, phone records, and other communications that indicate Trump administration officials were involved in his Ukrainian dealings, something Giuliani has alluded to in media interviews. Giuliani told CNN last week that he had text messages that indicate the State Department was encouraging his work in Ukraine and that he was going to, quote, use them to protect myself if and when I need them. The subpoena announcement comes one day after Giuliani said in an interview that he would not cooperate with House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff's investigation.
Will you cooperate with the House Intelligence Committee?
I wouldn't cooperate with Adam Schiff. I think Adam Schiff should be removed.
In addition to the Giuliani subpoena, we have two other pieces of breaking news this hour. First, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was among the administration officials who listened in on President Trump's July 25th call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And according to the New York Times, President Trump pushed the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to help Attorney General Bill Barr gather information for a Justice Department inquiry the president hopes will discredit the Mueller investigation. We have got the best team of reporters covering all of these fast-moving developments. From the White House, NBC News' Hans Nichols. On Capitol Hill, NBC's Jeff Bennett. NBC's Ken Delanian covers the intelligence community. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams. And joining us from the New York Times, one of the reporters who just broke that story about the Australian Prime Minister, Katie Benner. She joins us on the phone. Katie, since you have the most recent reporting in the past hour, I'm going to start with you. NBC News has confirmed this as well. But tell us what exactly happened on this call between Donald Trump and the Prime Minister of Australia.
Sure. So this phone call was between Donald Trump and the Prime Minister of Australia. Basically, the president was saying to the Prime Minister, listen, you're going to be getting contact from my Justice Department. William Barr, the Attorney General, is working on a really big inquiry right now into the roots of how my presidential campaign was surveyed, and I hope that you work with him. Now, the Justice Department has made clear, different officials have said that this was really at Bill Barr's request, that he asked the president to please do this, to make those introductions to other foreign leaders whose countries could have information pertinent to this review, which is being led by the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, John Durham.
You also write that this is basically the president of the United States, I guess through Bill Barr or because of Bill Barr, asking the Australian government to investigate itself.
Yes, because we know that there was a conversation with an Australian official and George Papadopoulos that really kicked off a lot of what became the Mueller investigation. So that is true. And also we understand that, no matter what Attorney General Bill Barr thinks of this investigation, why he wants to look into it, he has always said that he just wants to know whether or not the surveillance activity around the Trump campaign was lawfully predicated. It's clear that the president himself sees this very differently. He sees this as almost a settling of scores, a way to clear his name. And also, he believes that Bill Barr is kind of his guy, his almost a personal lawyer, as we saw in the Ukraine transcript. And that is something that I think the Justice Department has tried to distance itself from.
Well, explain that, because you write that this underscores the extent to which Mr. Trump sees the Attorney General as a critical partner in his goal to show that the Mueller investigation had corrupt and partisan origins. Does the president see Bill Barr as his Roy Cohn? Is that what this reporting is indicating, along with the other reporting that we've been seeing build up over the past few days?
Yeah, I think that we've known for a long time that President Trump believes that whoever the Attorney General is should be his Roy Cohn, and he said it in many different ways. I need my Roy Cohn. He has said that that is the role that Eric Holder played for Barack Obama. He has said that that is the role that RFK played for JFK. So it's truly something he believes, and it's clear from the Ukraine transcript that he does believe he has that in Bill Barr. People around the Attorney General say that that is not true. That is the president's perception, but clearly, President Trump is willing to express that perception to other people.
Pete Williams, what is the position of the Justice Department?
Well, I think Katie's expressed it pretty well here. And I, frankly, have a lot to add to what she's already said because I've heard much the same thing. I will say, if you put the New York Times story back on screen for a moment, they do quibble with one word that's in Katie's lead, or whoever wrote the lead at the New York Times. The Times story says that the president pushed the Australia. I guess we don't have the first sentence of it. That's the headline. Well, pressed is the headline they use.
But pushed is in the first sentence as well.
Yeah, pushed is in the first sentence. And what they say, this wasn't a push. They tell me at Justice this was an ask. And as Katie has described it, they say this is the kind of routine thing when one law enforcement agency wants the help of another law enforcement agency in another country. The heads of state will basically grease the skids for that. I think the thing to bear in mind here, just to perhaps amplify on something that Katie said, is we know about Bill Barr's interest. He's been quite straightforward about this. In May is when he appointed John Durham, the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, to look into the origins of the investigation of the Trump campaign, whether it was started on firm foundation and whether sufficient legal safeguards were in place. He's always said that's his interest. So the Inspector General of the Justice Department is going in one direction. You have Durham in this other direction here. And I think the question now is that separate from whatever Rudy Giuliani may have been doing? Yeah. And as far as we know, the answer to that is yes. They seem to be going off in different directions.
Let me ask you, in the Justice Department's opinion, what's the difference between this and the Ukraine phone call? Because I know that they've tried to distance themselves from that phone call, claiming that although Donald Trump said, I'm going to have Bill Barr call you repeatedly, that Bill Barr never got that message and never did make that call.
Yeah, well, and I think the reason they say that the difference is that, there's a well-established reason for wanting to know what happened in Australia, because of the fact that it's now documented. The Mueller report never says it, but the Australians have never made any secret of the fact that the sort of thing that the first domino that fell was Australians telling George Papadopoulos that the Russians had dirt that they wanted to pass along on Hillary Clinton. So if you're trying to go back to sort of patient zero, it does seem to be somebody in Australia. And so I think what they would say at Justice is...
Papadopoulos telling the Australians that Russians had emails, right?
Pardon me, yes.
Yes,
right.
Just to be clear.
Yes, thank you. That's the way that the U.S. learned about it. That's the way the FBI learned about it. And so you can understand why Durham would want to start there rather than, say, look at Ukraine, where let's say that the indicators aren't as strong.
This doesn't happen in a vacuum, and the request by the president for Australia to look into the 2016 election, basically the origins of the Mueller investigation, comes on the heels of us learning about the Ukraine phone call and all the work that Giuliani has done, and the request that the president made, not just about CrowdStrike and a server in the 2016 election, but also to look into Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden, even though the Ukrainians had said that there was no there in the past. The Wall Street Journal is now reporting that Mike Pompeo was on that phone call. Hans Nichols, the State Department had tried to distance themselves from this phone call as well, quibbling with somebody else not being on the call. What does it say to you now that there's reporting that Pompeo was on the call?
Well, we don't know if this was a planned official leak by the State Department or whether or not this was the reporter who actually ferreted this out, in which case it could still be damaging to the State Department. What we do know is that John Bolton wasn't on that call. It's fairly standard to have some people listen to this call. You know, I think when we reconstruct all this, and now that we have not a transcript, but a call log, you really get a sense for how the president views his role in these conversations with foreign leaders. The president insists, and he's done that, several times over the weekend, he did it again today, that his behavior was perfect. Well, now that we know that Pompeo was on the call, and we know that congressional Democrats want to subpoena Pompeo for documents, now they could potentially subpoena Pompeo and ask him if he thought that the president's response, the president's behavior on that, was indeed as perfect as the president says. Now, Pompeo likely can invoke some sort of privilege, right? This could be either absolute immunity or executive privilege, and those will be legal fights to come. Back to the other story, the Barr story. Among the interesting aspects of this is the double secret lockdown that the White House apparently imposed on transcripts. Is that now loosened? And I'm not going to ask Katie to reveal any of her sources, but if there are other phone calls that we could be getting readouts in a drip, drip, drip fashion like this from great reporting around at different news organizations, that presents a new threat to the White House, even if they don't think this particular story is terribly damaging, which by all accounts they don't. They're quite comfortable with this story, it seems like.
Katie, was this call also put on lockdown the same way the Ukraine call was?
Well, yeah, it's clear that this call is one that was treated very seriously, and we know that the call was restricted. This call's transcript was also restricted to a small group of presidential aides. So it's clear that people want to take a lot of the president's communications and sort of put it on lockdown. It is unclear whether or not it was put on lockdown because this has happened so many times and it's sort of become a routine, or if it was put on lockdown because anybody was uncomfortable with anything that Mr. Trump may have said during the call. Now, per our reporting, as far as the Justice Department is concerned, they do not think that there was anything untoward in this call. And again, they really feel that they are the reason for the call. They've asked for it, and the president complied. But, to the other gentleman's point, surely many other calls made by Mr. Trump for many different reasons have been put on lockdown. And now, because of the whistleblower and because of questions about the president's behavior writ large and the impeachment inquiry, there could be some will within the administration for people to start dribbling out more information about a variety of different calls. And that could be a long, long news cycle for the White House.
Finally, Jeff Bennett, what was our lead story until this New York Times story broke and then the Wall Street Journal story broke about Pompeo? Rudy Giuliani himself being subpoenaed by House intelligence. He said that he wouldn't cooperate with Adam Schiff. Any reason to believe that has changed?
Well, he may not have a choice, Katie, and here's why. Now that we're working within this framework of a formal impeachment inquiry, the message that House Democrats are sending to people whom they subpoena is now ignore us at your own peril. So specifically in this letter, they say that if Rudy Giuliani fails to submit the requested documents, that could be grounds for another article of impeachment. It would be obstruction of justice. Now, I doubt this committee has had time to digest the stories breaking tonight regarding the Secretary of State and the Attorney General. Even as I was walking down here before these stories broke, they already had an existing deadline of this Friday for the Secretary of State to turn over requested Ukraine documents. Now they're adding an October 15th deadline for Giuliani to turn over the documents that they're requesting from him. That, of course, also is the day that members return here. I think what's interesting, the shift that we've seen from House Democrats is not just this really quick timeline, but also the way that they're talking about it. I think Nancy Pelosi and Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic caucus chairman, they had a call yesterday with their members, and they tried to impress upon their members the gravity of what they're grappling with here. And so Nancy Pelosi told her members, it can't just be that you don't like Donald Trump. That's not what this is about. This is about defending the Constitution. And one of the things I heard from a top House Democrat is that this will be the fourth president in the history of the Republic to face this impeachment investigation question. Nixon, of course, resigned before he could be impeached. Andrew Johnson back in the 1880s, that had to do with policies after the Civil War. We all know why Bill Clinton was impeached. Of course, wasn't convicted by the Senate. But in this instance, you have a president who faces impeachment on national security grounds, that his behavior was an abject, profound failure, as Democrats see it, to uphold the oath of office and to protect the integrity of our elections. So that is what you are seeing from House Democrats. That's the message, and that's the way they're talking about this. even as this picture
Yeah.
of perceived wrongdoing grows beyond, apparently now, just this call with President Trump and his Ukrainian counterpart.
You talk about working quickly, Jeff. I'm sure the viewers can hear it. I can hear it. It's echoing behind you. That's because there's nobody there on Capitol Hill. Congress is on recess, but it seems the Intelligence Committee and the committees that are working on this impeachment inquiry are still working, as we know that Rudy Giuliani obviously just got these subpoenas. And Ken, I want to read a portion from the subpoena to Rudy Giuliani because it's very strongly worded. Our inquiry includes an investigation of credible allegations that you acted as an agent of the president in a scheme to advance his personal political interests by abusing the power of the office of the president. A growing public record, including your own statements, indicates that the president, you, and others appear to have pressed the Ukrainian government to pursue two politically motivated investigations. Ken, they're not quibbling here. They're saying the president abused his power, and they're saying, as Jeff was saying, that this is a national security issue.
Absolutely, Katie. And what's so fascinating about this is that we've known some of this for some time. Giuliani's role in Ukraine has been out there and in the news and reported on. But the fact that the president got involved in that phone call with the president of Ukraine has elevated this to a different level. And so this House subpoena is based in part on news reports. They're asking about some Florida fixers that Giuliani reportedly hired to help him deal with Ukraine. They're asking about political contributions to a Trump super PAC. But what they're saying is, if you don't produce this information, we are going to consider that obstructing the inquiry, and that could be grounds for a further article of impeachment. So they're really amping up the pressure. It remains to be seen how they can enforce these subpoenas. Their enforcement mechanism tends to be a contempt citation, and that has to be enforced by the Justice Department if it's a criminal contempt citation, and the DOJ has been loath to do that. But this is a political process, Katie, and what we're seeing is public opinion building towards the idea that this is very serious. There's a new poll that suggests that 47% of registered voters would be in favor of impeachment and removal, 47% against. That's a big move. And so to the extent to which the House is seeking to force its will and get this information, they have a growing body of public opinion behind them that wants answers.
And Ken, they're also looking for not only documentation from Rudy Giuliani, but text messages that he flaunted on national television.
Yeah, that's right. Famously, they want everything. They want the records. They want emails, text messages, records of phone calls. And Giuliani is flatly saying he's not going to work with Adam Schiff. He's not going to answer this demand and this request. And that really ups the stakes because Rudy Giuliani is a private citizen. He's not protected by executive privilege or so-called testimonial immunity, which the White House has invoked for other current and former White House officials. And so the House has shown itself, this is a multi-committee request here, backed by the Speaker of the House. They have shown themselves seriously committed to getting a response and prepared to go the contempt route, it appears.
Jeff, Congressman McCarthy, Jordan Nunes, and Nunes have written a letter to the IG Atkinson. And what they're doing is they're asking the Inspector General of the intelligence community, they're complaining basically about the whistleblower complaint. They write that at no point in your letter or in any of the following information provided to the House Intelligence Committee related to this issue did you indicate that your office found any of the whistleblower's allegations to be based on firsthand knowledge during the preliminary review you undertook to determine whether the complaint appeared credible and met the statutory definition of urgent concern. They're still quibbling with the secondhand knowledge, Jeff, but the White House's own readout of the call confirms everything the whistleblower said. Furthermore, the White House confirmed what the whistleblower alleged, that this phone call was placed on a code word level secure server, usually reserved for covert activity. The White House has confirmed two of the biggest aspects of this whistleblower complaint. I'm just trying to figure out what exactly Nunes and Meadows and Jordan are trying to get at here.
Well, the strategy, and we've seen this before, is to attack the messenger if you don't think you'll be successful in attacking the underlying message. And we saw this actually play out in the hearing the other day. Elise Stefanik, the Republican member from New York, made that same point, that because the whistleblower had secondhand knowledge, this, in her words, was a political hack job. Joaquin Castro went directly after her and asked the acting DNI, he says, is the whistleblower complaint in alignment with the White House summary of the phone call? And he answered, the DNI, acting DNI, answered in the affirmative and said, yes, it was. Another thing about this, Mark Zaid, who represents the whistleblower in this case, makes clear that there's no law in the books anywhere. There's no statute that says a whistleblower complaint can't be reliant upon hearsay evidence, that it always has to be a sort of a first-person narrative. So this is, again, Republicans, I think, trying to reactivate a talking point, and this isn't a partisan view, this is a statement of fact. Republicans trying to reactivate a talking point that had already really been dismantled at that hearing the other day with the acting director of national intelligence.
Again, the whistleblower's complaint was confirmed by the White House. They released what they say is the text of that call, the readout of the call, though it was not word for word. And also, they confirmed that this call was moved from the normal server to the secret server, the more secret server. They put it on lockdown, as the whistleblower alleged. Hans Nichols, Jeff Bennett, Pete Williams, Ken Delanian, and Katie Benner on the phone. Everyone, thank you very much.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.